yield now to Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I'd like to focus my line of questioning on Russia's views toward Ukraine. In March 2014, Russia illegally annexed the Ukrainian territory of Crimea, beginning a conflict which has effectively yet to be resolved. Admiral Rogers, can you please briefly describe, as you understand it, sir, how Russia took Crimea?
I would argue to the insertion of military force. They occupied it and physically removed it from Ukrainian control.
Sir, we've heard terms like little green men and hybrid warfare. Can you please explain how these relate to Russia and Ukraine?
So on the Ukraine side, what we saw was over time, rather than the kind of overt kind of activity we saw to such a degree on the Crimea side, what we saw was a much bigger effort on the influence and the attempts to distance Russian actions from any potential blowback to the Russian state, if you will, and hence the use of the little green men, surrogates in military, unmarked military uniforms, the flow of information, the provision of resources to support the forcible separation of the Ukraine.
Admiral, has Russia returned Crimea back to Ukraine, sir?
No.
Do they have intentions to?
They publicly indicated that they will not.
Admiral, why does Russia even care about Ukraine?
I'm sure in their view, they view this as a primary national interest for them. It's on the immediate periphery of the Russian state.
Am I right, sir, that they see it as a part of their broader objective to influence and impact Ukraine's desire for self-determination?
Yes, I think that's part of it.
Sir, as Russia tried to claim stolen territory in Ukraine, the U.S. and the rest of the world saw the annexation for what it was, a crime. Shortly after Russia invaded, the United Nations essentially declared it a crime in a non-binding resolution. And our own government, recognizing the seriousness of the event, instituted new sanctions against Russia. Is that right, sir?
Yes, sir.
Now, this was a time where much of the world was united. Russia invaded another country and illegally annexed its territory, as we all stood shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. Now, one person who didn't see it that way, however, was President Donald Trump. On July 30th, in an interview with ABC News, Mr. Trump said of Putin, and I quote, "He's not going into Ukraine, okay? Just so you understand, he's not going into Ukraine, all right?" End quote. Now, Admiral, hadn't Putin already gone into Ukraine 2 years before and hadn't left?
We're talking about that Crimea and the influence in the Ukraine generally. Yes, sir.
And he still hasn't left, correct, sir?
Now we're starting to get into some very technical questions about are the Russians physically in the Ukraine. Is it surrogates? The Crimea is a very clean example, though, to me. They outright invaded with armed military force and have annexed it.
But are they effectively still in Ukraine?
They're certainly supporting the ongoing effort in the Ukraine to split that country.
We'll get back to Mr. Trump in a minute. First, tell me, sir, what would it mean to Russia and to Putin to have sanctions lifted?
Clearly, even easing of economic impact, greater flexibility, more resources.
Now, according to NATO analysis, the Russian economy shrunk by as much as 3.5% in 2015 and had no growth in 2016, in big part because of Western sanctions, especially those against the oil and gas industry. Now, we're talking about a loss of over $135 billion just in the first year of sanctions. That's a huge sum of money. And sanctions aren't meant to push their economy over a cliff, but to put long-term pressure on Putin to change his behavior. Putin himself said in 2016 that sanctions are severely harming Russia. So we know they've had success in putting pressure on the Kremlin. Admiral, what would it mean geopolitically? Would it help legitimate Russia's illegal land grab?
Sir, I'm not in a position to talk broadly about the geopolitical implications. I mean, we have stated previously, from an intelligence perspective, we have tried to outline to policymakers the specifics of the Russian invasion of Crimea, the specifics of the continued Russian support to separatists in the Ukraine, the Russians' continued attempt to pressure and to keep the Ukraine weak.
Would it help cleave the United States from her allies?
If we remove the sanctions?
There's a lot at stake here for Russia. This is big money, big strategic implications. If they can legitimate their annexation of Crimea, what's next? Are we looking at a new Iron Curtain descending across Eastern Europe? You know, most in our country recognize what is at stake and how the United States, as a leader of the free world, is the only check on Russian expansion. So, back to Mr. Trump and his cohort. At the Republican convention in July, Paul Manafort, Carter Page, and Trump himself changed the Republican Party platform to no longer arm Ukraine. So, the same month that Trump denied Putin's role in Ukraine, his team weakened the party platform on Ukraine. And, as we have and will continue to hear, this was the same month that several individuals in the Trump orbit held secret meetings with Russian officials, some of which may have been on the topic of sanctions against Russia for their intervention in Ukraine. Now, this is no coincidence, in my opinion. In fact, the dossier written by former MI6 agent Christopher Steele alleges that Trump agreed to sideline Russian intervention in Ukraine as a campaign issue, which is effectively a priority for Vladimir Putin. There's a lot in the dossier that is yet to be proven, but increasingly, as we'll hear throughout the day, allegations are checking out. And this one seems to be as accurate as they come. In fact, there is also one pattern I want to point out before yielding back. Manafort, fired. Page, fired. Flynn, fired. Why? They were hired because of their Russian connections. They were fired. However, because their connections became public, they were effectively culpable. But they were also the fall guys. So I think after we hear Mr. Quigley's line of questioning, we might guess who could be next. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, I yield back.